The transport shuttle hummed quietly as it moved through space toward the massive station floating in the darkness. Commander Jake Martinez looked out the small window at the incredible sight before them. Kepler-7 was bigger than any city he had ever seen on Earth. Lights sparkled across its surface like stars, and ships from dozens of different worlds came and went like busy insects around a hive. "Dad, look at that one." 8-year-old Lucy Martinez pressed her face against the window, pointing at a strange ship that looked like it was made of crystal. Her brown eyes were wide with excitement. "It's so pretty. Do you think the people inside can see through the walls?" Jake smiled at his daughter's endless curiosity. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe we'll find out when we get to the station." He was nervous about this assignment, but Lucy's excitement made him feel better. The cultural exchange program was important for human-alien relations, but bringing his young daughter to an alien research station still felt like a big risk. The shuttle docked with a soft bump, and soon they were walking through corridors filled with beings Jake had only seen in training videos. Tall, blue-skinned Altarians glided past with their flowing robes. Small, furry centauri chattered in groups, their big ears twitching as they talked. And there were the Vraxians, with their 4 eyes and careful, measured movements. Lucy held her father's hand tightly, but she wasn't scared. She was studying everything around her with the same focus she used when working on her puzzle books at home. "The tall blue ones move like dancers," she whispered to her father. "And the furry ones sound like they're singing when they talk." Professor Zethkar stood in the main corridor, watching the new arrivals. His 4 eyes moved independently, taking in details that single-eyed species often missed. He had been studying different types of intelligence for most of his long life, and he prided himself on understanding how different minds worked. The Vraxian way of thinking was logical, step by step, never rushing to conclusions without proper evidence. He had read the files on the human visitors. Commander Martinez was a skilled military officer and diplomat. His daughter was listed as gifted in the human education system, whatever that meant. Professor Zethkar had seen many species, claimed their young were special. Usually, it just meant they learned their own culture's ways of thinking a little faster than average. "Welcome to Kepler-7, said Dr. Kane Phillips, the human scientist who met them at the docking port. He had been working with alien researchers for 5 years and served as a bridge between human and non-human ways of thinking. "How was your trip?" "Long but smooth," Jake replied, shaking the doctor's hand. "Lucy here hasn't stopped asking questions since we left Earth." Dr. Phillips knelt down to Lucy's level. "Hi there, Lucy. I hear you're going to be joining our Young Scholars program while your dad is in meetings." Lucy nodded seriously. "I brought my puzzle books, but Mom said I should try the alien puzzles too. She said they might be different from Earth puzzles." "Your mother is very smart," Dr. Phillips said with a grin. "Would you like to see the classroom?" As they walked through the station, Professor Zethkar followed at a distance, observing. The human child moved differently than young Vraxians. She didn't walk in straight lines, but seemed to drift toward anything that caught her interest. She stopped to watch maintenance robots working, tilted her head to listen to alien conversations, and asked her father questions about everything she saw. "She processes information in a scattered pattern," the professor noted to himself, typical of unfocused young minds. The classroom was a marvel of interspecies cooperation. Young beings from 6 different worlds sat at stations designed for their various physical needs. The Vraxian children sat straight and still, working through mathematical problems with careful precision. The Altarian youth used their long fingers to manipulate floating geometric shapes. The Centauri young ones worked in small groups, their natural talent for pattern recognition, making them excellent at visual puzzles. Lucy was shown to a station designed for human physiology. The chair adjusted to her small size, and the display screen lowered to her eye level. She looked around at her new classmates with interest, giving a small wave to a young Vraxian who stared back with all four eyes. Today, we begin with spatial reasoning exercises, announced the teaching assistant, a patient Altarian named Selek. Please access the first puzzle on your displays. Professor Zethkar positioned himself where he could observe all the students. This was his specialty, watching how different young minds approached problems. The Vraxian children would break down the puzzle into small parts and solve each piece systematically. The Altarians would see the geometric relationships immediately. The Centauri would work together, sharing insights and building on each other's ideas. The puzzle appeared on all the screens, a three-dimensional maze that rotated slowly in space. The goal was to guide a small light from the entrance to the exit, but the maze changed shape every few seconds, closing some paths and opening others. Professor Zethkar started his timer and settled in to watch. Based on his research, he expected the Vraxian children to solve it in about 15 minutes through careful mapping. The Altarians might finish in 10 minutes using their spatial gifts. The Centauri working together could probably manage it. In 12 minutes, the human child, he predicted, would take much longer. Human young were known to be emotional and easily distracted. Without the systematic thinking of Vraxians or the natural spatial abilities of Altarians, she would probably struggle with the complex, changing puzzle. Lucy stared at the screen for a moment, her head tilted slightly to one side. Then she began, moving her fingers across the control interface, guiding the small light through the maze. Her movements were quick and confident, as if she could see something the others couldn't. Professor Zethkar's four eyes focused on her with growing interest. She wasn't mapping the maze systematically like the Vraxian children. She wasn't calculating angles like the Altarians. She seemed to be following some kind of invisible pattern, turning left and right through the changing maze as if she knew. Where the walls would move before they actually moved. 90 seconds after starting, Lucy's light reached the exit. The professor's eyes blinked rapidly in confusion. He looked at his timer, then at Lucy's screen, then back at his timer. Surely there had been some mistake. He had seen many gifted young beings over the years, but this was impossible. The puzzle was designed to take at least 10 minutes, even for the most talented students. Selek, he called to the teaching assistant. Please check the human child station. There may be a malfunction in her puzzle program. Selek glided over to Lucy's station and examined the display. The program is functioning correctly, Professor. She has successfully completed the maze puzzle. Lucy looked up at the tall Altarian teacher with a smile. That was fun. Do you have any harder ones? Professor Zethkar felt something he rarely experienced, complete bewilderment. In 40 years of studying interspecies intelligence, he had never seen anything like this. Either the human child had somehow cheated, or everything he thought he knew about problem-solving was wrong. He decided to find out which it was. Professor Zethkar could not sleep that night. He kept thinking about what he had seen in the classroom. The human child had solved the maze puzzle faster than any student he had ever observed. It went against everything he knew about how young minds worked. He arrived at his laboratory early the next morning and spent hours checking the puzzle program. Every line of code was perfect. The maze was exactly as difficult as he had designed it to be. There were no shortcuts, no hidden paths, no ways to cheat. The human child had simply solved it through pure problem-solving ability. Impossible, he muttered to himself as he reviewed the data for the 10th time. There must be an explanation. When morning classes began, Professor Zethkar was ready. He had prepared a new puzzle, one that was even more complex than the first. This time, he would watch every move the human child made. He would find out how she was doing it. The classroom filled with young students again. Lucy Martinez bounced into the room with the same excited energy as the day before. She waved at the young Vraxian named Quelm, who had been watching her with curious eyes since yesterday. The other students took their usual seats and prepared for the day's challenges. Today, we have a special puzzle, Professor Zethkar announced. It is a three-dimensional maze like yesterday, but with additional challenges. The maze will not only change shape, but it will also rotate in space. Gravity will shift, making some paths become walls and some walls become floors. You must guide your light through this changing environment. The Vraxian children nodded seriously. This type of puzzle required careful planning and step-by-step thinking. They would need to map each possible change and calculate the best path. Through every rotation, the Altarian students extended their long fingers, ready to manipulate the complex spatial relationships. Their species had natural gifts for understanding how objects moved in 3 dimensions, but even they would need time to track all the changes. The Centauri students huddled together, ready to share ideas and work as a team. Their pattern recognition abilities were strong, but this puzzle had many different patterns happening at the same time. Lucy looked at her screen with the same tilted head as before. The puzzle appeared, a complex maze floating in space, already beginning to rotate slowly. Walls shifted and changed, creating new paths while closing others. The gravitational fields were marked with different colors, showing which way was up or down in each section. Professor Zethkar started his timer and focused all 4 eyes on Lucy's station. He would not miss a single movement this time. Lucy began to move her fingers across the controls. But instead of the careful, systematic approach that the professor expected, she seemed to be dancing with the puzzle. Her light moved through the maze in smooth, flowing motions, turning and rising and falling as if it were following music that only she could hear. The professor watched in amazement as Lucy's light navigated through the shifting maze. When a wall appeared in front of her path, she had already turned away. When gravity shifted and made a floor become a ceiling, her light was already moving in the right direction. It was as if she could see the changes before they happened. 2 minutes. And 15 seconds after starting, Lucy's light reached the exit. Professor Zethkar stared at his timer. The youngest Vraxian students were still mapping the first level of the maze. The Altarians were working on understanding the rotation patterns. The Centauri team was discussing which approach to try first. "This is not possible," the professor said out loud. Lucy looked up from her completed puzzle. "Professor, was that one supposed to be harder?" It felt about the same as yesterday. The professor's 4 eyes blinked rapidly. "Child, how did you know where to go when the maze was changing?" Lucy thought for a moment. "I don't know. I just looked at it and could see where the paths would be. Like when you look at clouds and can see what shapes they're going to make. Next, but there are mathematical calculations involved. Gravity equations, spatial rotations, timing sequences. You cannot simply see the answer," Lucy shrugged. "I didn't do any math. I just followed the path that felt right." Professor Zethkar felt his carefully organized world beginning to crack. Everything he had learned about intelligence and problem-solving told him that complex puzzles required systematic thinking. There had to be logical steps, careful analysis, mathematical calculations. You could not just feel your way through a puzzle that had stumped graduate students. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "you would like to try another puzzle?" Lucy nodded eagerly. "Yes, please. These are fun." The professor quickly designed a 3rd puzzle, even more complex than the first 2. This one required understanding quantum probability. The maze existed in multiple dimensions at the same time. Each path the light took would change the probability of other paths existing. It was a puzzle designed for advanced university students who had studied quantum mechanics for years. "This puzzle," the professor announced, "involves multiple realities. Each choice you make will affect what choices are possible later. You must think several steps ahead and consider how your actions change the puzzle itself. The other students looked confused. This was far beyond their level of understanding. Even the teaching assistants seemed uncertain about how to approach such a complex problem. Lucy looked at the screen where the multidimensional maze flickered between different possible states. Lines of probability stretched between paths, showing how likely each route was to exist. Mathematical equations floated beside the maze, explaining the quantum relationships. She ignored the equations completely. Instead, she watched the flickering maze for about 30 seconds, her brown eyes tracking the changing patterns. Then she began to move her light through the puzzle, making choices that seemed random but somehow worked perfectly. Each path she chose made the next path more likely to exist. Each turn she took opened up new possibilities while closing off dead ends. Professor Zethkar watched in stunned silence as Lucy navigated through multiple dimensions of reality as easily as walking through her own house. She made no calculations, consulted no equations, followed no systematic approach. She simply moved through the puzzle as if she could see the invisible connections between all the different possibilities. 4 minutes later, her light emerged from the final dimension and reached the exit. The professor stared at the completed puzzle, then at Lucy, then back at the puzzle. His hands shook slightly as he set down his timer. "Child," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "what did you see when you looked at that puzzle?" Lucy tilted her head thoughtfully. It was like a story. All the different paths were like different ways the story could go. I just followed the path that made the best story. A story? The professor's voice cracked. You solved the quantum probability puzzle by treating it like a story? Sure, Lucy said with a smile. The light wanted to get home, so I helped it find the way that made all the other paths happy too. It's like when you're telling a story and you want everyone in the story to have a good ending. Professor Zethkar sat down heavily in his chair. He had spent 40 years studying intelligence across 12 different species. He had written papers on cognitive development, problem-solving strategies, and the mathematical foundations of logical thinking. He had been proud of his systematic approach to understanding how minds worked out, and now an 8-year-old human child had just solved one of the most complex puzzles in his collection by treating it like a bedtime story. Dr. Phillips, he called to the human scientist who was observing from the back of the room. I need to speak with you immediately. Dr. Phillips walked over with a knowing smile on his face. Interesting morning, Professor? Dr. Phillips, the professor said, his 4 eyes focused intently on the human scientist. I believe I need to completely rethink everything I know about intelligence. Dr. Phillips found Professor Zethkar in his laboratory at midnight, surrounded by floating holographic displays showing brain scans, puzzle solutions, and complex mathematical equations. The Vraxian scientist had not left his lab for 3 days, working frantically to understand what he had witnessed. Professor, you need to rest, Dr. Phillips said gently. You've been working non-stop since Lucy solved the quantum puzzle. Professor Zethkar's 4 eyes were bloodshot and tired, but they burned with intense curiosity. Dr. Phillips, I have studied intelligence for 40 years. I have observed thousands of young minds from dozens of species. What I saw that human child do should not be possible. What specifically troubles you? Dr. Phillips asked, settling into a chair beside the exhausted alien scientist. Everything, the professor replied, gesturing at his displays. Look at these recordings. When Vraxian children solve puzzles, their brain activity follows predictable patterns. Neural pathways activate in sequence, moving from sensory input to logical processing to motor output. It is organized, systematic, efficient. He switched to another display, showing brain scans of different species. Altarians show similar patterns, but with enhanced activity and spatial reasoning areas. Centauri minds light up in social processing regions when they work together. Every species follows logical, measurable patterns. And Lucy? Dr. Phillips asked, though he already knew what the professor had discovered. Professor Zethkar pulled up Lucy's brain scans, recorded during her puzzle-solving sessions. The display showed something that looked like a lightning storm. Neural activity flashed across her entire brain simultaneously, creating patterns that shifted and changed faster than the recording equipment could track. Her brain does not follow. Sequential processing, the professor said in amazement. Look at this. When she sees a puzzle, her entire mind activates at once. Logical reasoning, spatial processing, pattern recognition, emotional centers, memory storage, creative thinking, even areas we do not fully understand. It is as if her whole brain becomes one giant processing unit. Dr. Phillips smiled. Now you're beginning to understand what makes humans special. But how is this possible? The professor demanded. Efficient thinking requires organized pathways. You cannot have all systems active at once without causing chaos and confusion. Unless chaos is exactly what you need, Dr. Phillips said quietly. Over. The next several days, Professor Zethkar designed a series of tests, unlike anything he had ever created before. He wanted to understand the limits of Lucy's abilities, to find the boundaries of this impossible type of thinking. He created puzzles that mixed logic with emotion, requiring the solver to consider not just mathematical solutions, but also how those solutions might make fictional characters feel. He designed challenges that combined scientific facts with artistic interpretation. He built problems that could only be solved by making connections between completely unrelated ideas. Lucy approached each test with the same cheerful curiosity she had shown from the beginning. She would look at the puzzle for a moment, tilt her head, then begin working with quick, confident movements. She rarely took more than a few minutes to solve problems that the professor expected to take hours. This puzzle requires understanding both quantum physics and ancient poetry. The professor explained as he presented her with a challenge that had taken him 3 days to design. The solution involves finding connections between mathematical equations and emotional metaphors. Lucy looked at the display showing complex physics formulas on one side and lines of poetry on the other. Oh, I see, she said after a moment. The equations are like the poem about the lonely star. They're both talking about things that want to be together, but are too far apart. The solution is to find the gravity that pulls them closer. She solved it in 6 minutes. The professor stared at her solution, which was not only correct, but revealed mathematical relationships he had not even noticed when designing the puzzle. How did you see that connection? The numbers felt sad, Lucy said simply, like the star in the poem. So I looked for what would make them happy. Numbers do not have emotions, the professor said weakly. These ones did, Lucy replied with certainty. Commander Martinez visited the laboratory during his lunch break, curious about why his daughter was spending so much time with the alien professor. He found Lucy working on what looked like the most complex puzzle he had ever seen, while Professor Zethkar watched her with the intensity of a scientist observing a new form of life. How's she doing? Jake asked Dr. Phillips. She's revolutionizing everything we thought we knew about intelligence. Dr. Phillips replied. Professor Zethkar has been studying cognitive development for 4 decades, and Lucy is showing him things he never imagined possible. Lucy's always been bright, Jake said with fatherly pride, but she's still just a kid. She spends half her time playing with dolls and watching cartoons. That might be exactly why she's so good at this, Dr. Phillips sighed thoughtfully. Adult minds get trained to think in specific ways. We learn to separate logic from emotion, facts from imagination, science from art, Lucy hasn't learned those boundaries yet. As if to prove his point, Lucy suddenly clapped her hands together. I got it, she announced. The puzzle is about friendship. She had been working on a problem involving interstellar navigation, quantum mechanics, and resource allocation. The official solution required complex calculations about fuel efficiency, gravitational assists, and optimal flight paths. Lucy's solution involved treating the spaceships like friends who wanted to help each other reach their destinations. Her approach was not only correct, but 23% more efficient than the standard solution. Professor Zethkar sat down heavily, his 4 eyes blinking rapidly. She solved a graduate-level engineering problem by thinking about friendship. Dad, can I show you something cool? Lucy asked, running over to her father. I made up a new puzzle game. She led him to a display where she had created something that looked like a combination of chess, 3-dimensional tic-tac-toe, and a musical instrument. A game board floated in space, changing colors and making soft sounds as pieces moved across it. You play by making patterns that sound pretty, Lucy explained. But you also have to think about what your opponent is feeling, and try to make moves that help both of you win. Commander Martinez looked at the game his 8-year-old daughter had invented. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, combining strategy, creativity, empathy, and musical harmony into a single activity. How do you win? He asked. Both players win when they make something beautiful together, Lucy said. The goal isn't to beat the other person. It's to make something neither of you could make alone. Professor Zethkar approached the game display with trembling hands. He had devoted his life to understanding intelligence, but he had always assumed that intelligence was about solving problems, finding answers, defeating challenges. Lucy had created something that redefined the very concept of what it meant to think. Dr. Phillips, he said quietly, I need to redesign my entire research program. Why? Dr. Phillips asked. Because I have been studying intelligence as if it were a tool for solving problems, the professor replied. But this child has shown me that intelligence might be something much more profound. It might be a way of connecting with the universe itself. Lucy overheard the conversation and smiled. Professor, do you want to play my game? I bet you'd be really good at it once you learn to listen to what the colors are trying to tell you. Professor Zethkar looked at the young human girl who had shattered his understanding of how minds worked. Yes, he said slowly. I would very much like to learn how to listen to colors. As they began to play, the professor realized that everything he had learned about intelligence had been just the beginning. Lucy wasn't just solving puzzles faster than anyone else. She was showing him that there were entirely different ways of thinking that he had never even imagined existed. Professor Zethkar spent the next week reading everything he could find about human brain development. What he discovered amazed him, even more than Lucy's puzzle-solving abilities. Human children, he learned, were born with brains that worked very differently from adult human brains. Dr. Phillips, he said excitedly, as he burst into the human scientist's office. I have been researching your species' neural development. Did you know that human children have twice as many neural connections as adults? Dr. Phillips looked up from his work with a patient smile. Yes, Professor. It's called synaptic pruning. As humans grow up, their brains eliminate connections that aren't used regularly. It makes adult thinking more efficient, but less flexible. But this means, the professor said, his 4 eyes wide with realization, that human children can process information in ways that become impossible as they age. Lucy's brain can make connections between ideas that adult brains would never consider. Exactly, Dr. Phillips nodded. Children like Lucy don't separate different types of thinking the way adults do. Logic, creativity, emotion, intuition, memory, and imagination all work together as one system. Professor Zethkar paced back and forth across the small office, This explains everything I have observed. When Lucy looks at a puzzle, she is not just using logical reasoning. She is using her entire mind as one giant pattern recognition system. She can see connections that exist below the level of conscious thought. And that's why she can solve problems so quickly, Dr. Phillips added. She doesn't need to work through each step, because her brain is processing all the steps simultaneously. The professor stopped pacing and stared at Dr. Phillips. I need to test this theory. I need to create a challenge that will push Lucy's abilities to their absolute limit. Over the next 2 days, Professor Zethkar worked on the most complex puzzle he had ever designed. It combined elements from every field of knowledge he could think of. The puzzle required understanding quantum mechanics, biology, mathematics, art, music, philosophy, and even cooking. It was not just difficult. It was designed to be impossible for any single mind to solve. The puzzle had been sitting unsolved in the Galactic Research Database for 8 months. Graduate students from 7 different species had attempted it. Teams of experts had worked on it for weeks at a time. The puzzle was famous throughout the academic community as an example of a problem that was simply too complex for any individual to understand completely. Lucy, Professor Zethkar said, as he presented the challenge to her, this puzzle is very different from the others. It requires knowledge about many different subjects that you have never studied. Most adults cannot even understand what the puzzle is asking, let alone solve it. Lucy looked at the massive display that filled the entire wall of the laboratory. Equations floated next to biological diagrams. Musical notes danced around geometric shapes. Philosophical questions were written in multiple alien languages. Pictures of food from dozens of worlds rotated slowly between star charts and poetry written in mathematics. It looks like a big story, Lucy said after studying the display for a few minutes. All these different pieces are trying to tell me something. What kind of story? The professor asked, leaning forward with intense curiosity. Lucy tilted her head and watched the swirling information for another moment. It's about different kinds of people who live far apart, but are really all connected. The math parts are like the skeleton that holds everything together. The biology parts are like the heart that makes it all alive. The music parts are like the voice that helps them talk to each other. She began moving her hands across the control interface, connecting different pieces of information in ways that seemed random, but felt somehow right. She linked a quantum equation to a cooking recipe, explaining that both were about combining ingredients in just the right proportions. She connected a star chart to a piece of music, showing how the rhythm matched the orbital patterns of distant planets. Professor Zethkar watched in growing amazement as Lucy treated the impossible puzzle like a children's story about friendship between different types of beings who lived in different worlds but shared the same dreams. The solution, Lucy announced 4 minutes later, is that they all need to work together. The math people are good at planning. The art people are good at making things beautiful. The music people are good at helping everyone stay in rhythm. And the cooking people know how to make sure everyone gets fed. She had solved the puzzle by recognizing that it was not really about academic subjects at all. It was a metaphor for cooperation between different types of intelligence. The solution required understanding that diversity of thinking was more powerful than any single type of knowledge. The display flashed green, indicating that Lucy had found the correct answer. But more than that, her solution revealed deeper patterns in the puzzle that none of the graduate students had noticed. She had not just solved the problem. She had shown everyone else what the puzzle was really about. Professor Zethkar stared at the solution display, his carefully organized worldview cracking completely apart. Everything he had believed about intelligence, about learning, about the superiority of systematic thinking, was wrong. "Child," he said in a whisper, "how did you know that the puzzle was about cooperation?" Lucy shrugged. It felt lonely. All those different pieces of information were sitting there by themselves, not talking to each other. They wanted to be friends, but they didn't know how. So I helped them find ways to connect. You felt that a puzzle was lonely? The professor asked weakly. Sure, Lucy said cheerfully. Information wants to be connected to other information. It's like people wanting to have friends. When you put the right pieces together, they make each other stronger and happier. Dr. Phillips, who had been watching silently from the corner, stepped forward. Professor, do you understand now what makes human intelligence special? Professor. Zethkar looked at the brain scans he had been studying, then at Lucy's puzzle solution, then at the young girl who was already looking around for something else interesting to explore. Humans do not just process information, he said slowly. They form emotional connections with information. They treat knowledge like a living thing that has wants and needs and feelings. And that's why Lucy can solve puzzles so quickly, Dr. Phillips explained. She's not fighting against the problem or trying to force a solution. She's listening to what the puzzle wants to become and helping it get there. Lucy had wandered over to another display where she was drawing pictures with her finger on the full touch screen. She was creating what looked like a map of the space station, but instead of showing corridors and rooms, her map showed the emotional connections between different areas. The happy places were colored bright yellow, the busy places were swirling blue and green, and the quiet thinking places were soft purple. She sees patterns that exist beyond the physical world, the professor realized. She can perceive relationships that cannot be measured or calculated. Commander Martinez arrived for his daily visit and found the professor staring at his daughter's emotional map of the station. How's Lucy doing today? Commander Martinez, the professor said, turning all 4 eyes toward the human officer. Your daughter has just revolutionized our understanding of intelligence itself. She has shown us that thinking is not just about processing information. It is about forming relationships with knowledge, treating ideas as living things that want to connect and grow. Jake Martinez looked at his 8-year-old daughter, who was now adding musical notes to her map to show how different parts of the station sounded. She's always been special, but I never thought about it like that. Commander, the professor said with absolute certainty, human children may hold the key to breakthrough discoveries that could change everything we know about science, technology, and life itself. Lucy looked up from her map and smiled at the 3 adults who were watching her with such serious expressions. I finished the feelings map of the station. Want to see which places are the happiest? 3 months after Lucy Martinez first stepped into the alien classroom, Professor Zethkar stood before the Galactic Council of Sciences. The great hall was filled with the most brilliant minds from dozens of worlds. Braxian logicians Altarian, spatial theorists, Centauri pattern analysts, and scientists from species he had never even met before. Honored colleagues, the professor began, his 4 eyes scanning the massive audience. Today I present findings that will change how we understand intelligence itself. For 40 years, I believed that systematic, logical thinking was the highest form of mental ability. I was wrong. A murmur went through the crowd. Professor Zethkar was known throughout the galaxy for his careful, methodical research. For him to admit being wrong about something so fundamental was shocking. I have discovered, he continued, that human children possess a type of intelligence that operates on principles we have never studied. They do not just solve problems. They form emotional relationships with information itself. They treat knowledge as a living thing that wants to grow and connect. On the great display behind him, recordings began playing of Lucy solving puzzles that had baffled graduate students. The audience watched in amazed silence as the small human child approached each challenge not as a battle to be won, but as a friend to be understood. This child, Professor Zethkar said, pointing to Lucy's image, solved our most complex puzzles by treating them as stories about cooperation and friendship. She discovered mathematical relationships by listening to what numbers wanted to tell her. She navigated quantum probabilities by helping different realities work together. A Vraxian scientist in the front row raised his hand. "Professor, surely, you are not suggesting that mathematics has emotions?" "I am suggesting," Professor Zethkar replied carefully, "that human minds can perceive patterns and connections that exist beyond our current understanding of how information works. They see relationships we cannot measure, feel connections we cannot calculate." Meanwhile, back on Kepler-7, Lucy was teaching her new friend Quelm how to solve puzzles using feeling instead of just thinking. The young Vraxian had been struggling with this concept for weeks, but Lucy was patient. "Don't try to calculate everything," Lucy said as they worked on a spatial puzzle together. "Look at the shapes and ask them what they want to become." Quelm's 4 eyes blinked rapidly. "Shapes do not want anything, Lucy. They are just geometric forms with mathematical properties." "Try it anyway," Lucy encouraged him. "Pretend the triangle is sad because it's all alone, and see if you can find other shapes that would make it happy." Quelm stared at the puzzle display, trying to think in this strange new way. Slowly, hesitantly, he began to move the shapes around. Instead of calculating angles and measuring distances, he tried to imagine what would make the triangle feel better. To his amazement, the puzzle began to make sense in a way it never had before. The shapes seemed to flow together naturally, creating patterns that felt right instead of just mathematically correct. When he finished, his solution was not only accurate, but more elegant than any he had created using pure logic. "I felt it," Quelm whispered in wonder. The shapes really did want to be connected. Dr. Phillips watched this interaction with deep satisfaction. He had known for years that human children had special abilities, but even he had not fully understood what Lucy was capable of until Professor Zethkar began studying her. "She's not just smart," he explained to Commander Martinez during one of their regular meetings. "She's showing us that intelligence itself might be more about empathy and connection than we ever realized." Jake Martinez nodded, though he still found it hard to believe that his daughter was causing such excitement in the scientific community. "Lucy's always been good with people. She makes friends everywhere we go. I guess she makes friends with puzzles, too." Back in the council hall, Professor Zethkar was presenting his most important discovery. "Based on my research, I believe that human children represent an evolutionary approach to intelligence that could revolutionize everything from artificial intelligence to interstellar navigation." He showed brain scans comparing Lucy's neural activity to that of other species. Human children use their entire brain as one connected system. They do not separate logic from emotion, creativity from analysis, or knowledge from feeling. This allows them to process information in ways that are impossible for more specialized minds. "What are the practical applications?" asked the Centauri researcher. "Unlimited," the professor replied. "Imagine navigation computers that could feel the best path through space instead of just calculating it. Picture artificial intelligence that could form genuine relationships with the beings it serves. Consider research methods that treat scientific discovery as a conversation with the universe itself." As the professor spoke, Lucy was creating something new in the station's youth center. She had gathered children from 6 different species and was teaching them to play her cooperation game together. The Vraxian children learned to trust their feelings. The Altarians discovered that spatial relationships could be musical. The Centauri found that working together felt different when they treated each other as friends instead of just teammates. "Look," Lucy said excitedly as the mixed group of alien children created something beautiful together on the game display. "When everyone thinks in their own special way, but also listens to their hearts, we can make things that none of us could make alone." Professor Zethkar's presentation concluded with a proposal that stunned the scientific community. I request permission to establish a new research center dedicated to studying intuitive intelligence. I want to learn how human children think so that we can teach these methods to other species and even to our computers. You want to change how we approach science itself, observed the council chairman, an ancient being whose species was known for their wisdom. Yes, Professor Zethkar replied without hesitation. I want us to stop treating knowledge as something to be conquered and start treating it as something to be befriended. I want us to learn how to think with our hearts as well as our minds. The vote was unanimous. The Galactic Council approved the new research center and appointed Professor Zethkar as its director. Scientists from dozens of worlds volunteered to study the revolutionary approaches that human children use to understand the universe. 6 months later, Commander Martinez found Professor Zethkar in his new laboratory, working alongside Lucy, and a group of young beings from 8 different species. They were solving problems that had challenged researchers for years, approaching each puzzle as if it were a new friend to understand rather than an enemy to defeat. Professor, Jake sighed, I never imagined that bringing Lucy here would cause such a revolution in scientific thinking. Professor Zethkar looked up from a display where Lucy was teaching a young Altarian how to solve mathematical problems by treating numbers like characters in a story. Commander Martinez, your daughter has not just solved puzzles. She has shown us that the universe itself might be more alive, more connected, and more friendly than we ever dared to imagine. Lucy looked up from her work and smiled at her father. Dad, did you know that when you're really nice to information, it tells you its secrets? Professor Zethkar is learning how to be friends with science, and science is teaching him amazing things. As Professor Zethkar watched Lucy return to her work, helping young minds from across the galaxy discover new ways of thinking, he realized that this was just the beginning. Human children had shown them that intelligence was not about being smarter than the universe, but about becoming part of it. The revolution in thinking had begun, and it started with a little girl who believed that even the loneliest puzzle just wanted to find a friend.